Guys, I know there's a question that's been burning deep in your very soul. What happens if you take an RTX 1490, you crank the resolution up to 4K, max out all of the graphics setting, yes, that does include ray tracing, but with only a single CPU core to run the games on? Now, if your first instinct is to throw the idea on the rocks and say there's just no way that modern AAA titles will run with only a single processor core to their name, well, actually, hold that thought, because surprisingly, a good number of titles do actually run, and some actually surprisingly well, with only a single CPU core. But also in this video, we're going to investigate, for titles which do want to play hardball, how many extra threads we need to throw at the problem to make them in a playable state. Either just so that they'll load at all, or to actually make it so that the frames are not so slow that you could, well, write a book in between each of them. So before we start looking at the actual tests themselves, let's quickly go over the hardware that we're going to be using. We're going to be running an Intel 13900K for our testing. I do actually have 14th generation processors available, but honestly the 13900K is more than okay for our testing. We're going to be running an Asus ROG Strix Z690 gaming Wi-Fi board, as well as 32GB of DDR5 memory. For what it's worth, Windows 11 and all of the games will be fully updated, and of course all of the titles will be running on an NVMe drive. So on the 13900K there are a mixture of two types of performance cores. The first are Raptor Cove, where we have 8 of them, and 16 Gracemont efficient cores. Now, without going too much into the weeds here, the performance cores have the ability to run 2 threads, whereas the E cores only can run a single thread. The P cores are just more powerful and also run at higher clock frequencies. Now, the BIOS of the Z690 board allows us to configure the CPU cores in different configurations. Unfortunately, you cannot disable all of the P cores, so you cannot just have one E core, for example, but we could have one single P core along with no E cores, 2 P cores, we could have 1 P core, 1 E core, and so on and so on. And this gives us a great deal of flexibility for our testing. Now, ray tracing will be enabled in all titles that do support it, of course. And again, we're going to be testing at the 4K resolution with all of the visual settings maxed out, apart from things like chromatic aberration and lens flare, because quite frankly, I just genuinely hate them. Oh, and naturally we are going to be CPU bound, as you'll see throughout the video in many of our games. So really and truly, the titles running at 1440p or 4K probably wouldn't make much of a difference in terms of the frame rates, because again, the GPU just isn't being given work fast enough by the CPU. However, I think it would just be really cool to see the utilization of the GPU, and well, also it's a YouTube video, so it just sounds better in a title. Now we've disabled all of the cores other than a single P core, let's go into Windows and make sure that things are working correctly. And yep, 1 P core with hyperthreading. This gives us 2 whole threads. Now, I'm certainly ready to do some high-end gaming, and with 2 whole threads available to us, that's a lot of computing power. What can go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a bit. As I alluded to at the beginning of this video, 2 threads, 1 performance core, just isn't enough for some games to be able to run, and you'll simply get crashes on startup. With that said, a good number of games do run in this state, and of course we'll be showing them throughout, but for the games which do want to play hardball, we'll of course be throwing more threads at the problem until eventually they either load and they become playable. But enough talk, let's get into the testing, since, well, that's what you're actually here for, right? Ghost of Tsushima is a beautiful looking game to be sure, but it's definitely one of those titles which is carried by the art direction, not just how good the lighting, textures and other visual assets look. The game started life on the PlayStation 4, and subsequently was tweaked for the PS5, and now of course has seen a release on the PC. It's a fantastic game, and I'd highly recommend you guys check it out if you're into these type of titles, but the real question the hardcore among you may want to know is, does it run with only a single processor core? Well, the answer is kind of. The frame rate is reasonable enough. It can chug into the 40s when there's combat going on, or just you're in a very open and big environment, which is quite frequently, and obviously that does impact lag, but the real issue with only a single P core is that there are visual glitches, and these are very obvious in some places. They start to disappear occasionally if you get closer, and other times, well, look at the doggies. The visual issues are immediately remedied if you throw any additional threads or cores at it, and if we run with a single P core and a single E core, it's absolutely playable. Well, that is until it crashed. That said, with 4 threads, so that's 2 P cores, the game was stable for me at any rate. So Returnal is one of those games which simply wouldn't load with a single performance core enabled. I mean, it had SMT on, what more could it want? These games sound like Oliver Twist to tell you, "Please sir, can I have some more cores?" Anyway, after loading the game up with those 2 cores, 4 threads, I'm greeted with a message which tells me about an unsupported config. I'm sure that won't cause many problems later though. As for performance, well, I'll let the gameplay do most of the talking here. Basically, in the beginning-ish area of the game, frame rates don't really dip too much under 80 or 90 with everything maxed out. Yeah, there are some hitches here or there, particularly when lots of stuff is streaming in on the background, but frankly, it's pretty damn playable. If the game was stable, you'd be very happy to play through this game, honestly. And we're just going to play a little bit further and, well, I guess the message with the whole unsupported config thing really did mean it was unsupported. Who would have figured? Anyway, let's try the game with only a single performance core and a single E core. And you know what? It actually does work. I didn't actually get a crash ironically with this configuration, weirdly enough. Now, obviously I'm not saying that the game won't crash. Crashes like this are very unpredictable, so I'm not suggesting it would work long term, but yeah, it's pretty interesting really. Cyberpunk does boot up with only a single P core, but we quickly learn after the game's release that Cyberpunk's engine is very CPU heavy, those poor 8th generation consoles. And with just 2 threads, the game quite literally just doesn't have enough resources available to schedule the necessary work fast enough. Indeed, you can tweak the visual settings as you like, and quality settings such as crowd density just doesn't help much either. DLSS frame generation is available to us given we are running an RTX 4090, but unfortunately its use here is limited. Input latency is all over the place and the minimum frame rates are dreadful. And frame generation just doesn't do much to help because of the constant stutter as you're moving around the city because, again, the game's engine just simply can't keep things loaded in fast enough. The great news is that if you bump the thread count up to 4 with 2 P cores, it offers an almost transformative experience over just 2. There are still performance hitches, of course, but they no longer totally kill the enjoyability of the game, and you can at least aim this time, so that's nice. The RTX 4090 is still being hideously underutilized, even with the ray tracing settings to max though, but it's very fun to test out, but of course the practicality here isn't too high. The Last of Us on PC launched with some significant issues, but patches have improved things considerably. But with that said, shader compilation times are still quite lengthy, so I enabled all of the cores for shader compilation, then restarted the PC with just a single P core, 2 threads enabled. In this state, The Last of Us 1 can be played with only a single core. The average frame rates actually sound pretty good. High 30s to low 40s. The problem becomes that when anything loads in, things become busy or hell, just randomly, frame times can absolutely tank and you get significant stuttering. This means just aiming at an enemy can be an absolute chore. So you could probably play through the game like this, but you won't really enjoy it. If you enable any additional P or E cores, the performance improves significantly, a little bit like in Cyberpunk, although it's not such a significant difference because the baseline of Cyberpunk with only a single P core is just so bad. What about Resident Evil 4? Well, this of course was one of the other big games of last year, and certainly the other big horror title aside from Dead Space, which I also covered in this video. Now, frankly, this game is super playable with only a single core, 2 threads. It will cling to high 30s to low 60s, depending of course on the different region that you're in, how many enemies you're facing. If there's a ton of explosions, smoke, general craziness that you'd expect from a game like this, then frame rates can certainly dip. But yeah, the RTX 4090 basically behaves similar to what you've seen in other games, even if you don't enable any upscaling solutions at all with all of the settings maxed, you're going to be idling between 30 to 40% usage of the GPU. Now I'm choosing gameplay near the beginning of the game here, just in case you've still not played this. I don't want to spoil things, but I think it's a good representation anyway of like some of the later regions of the game. The first of the UE5 games that I want to try out here is Tekken 8. I am using the demo, but frankly I suspect things are going to be pretty similar across the full retail release. I played a few matches against the CPU with different core configurations, but a single P core was playable enough. I didn't run into any crashes or anything like that. Now, yes, there were a couple of stutters here or there, which did make timing some combos a bit trickier, but ultimately the game ran and generally it clung to the target frame rate of 60 FPS. Loading times, like any of the other games we've seen here, improved considerably with more threads and cores available to it, but I can't really say much more about Tekken 8. The game runs, and I think that the environments being narrower in scope versus, let's say, an open world game such as Cyberpunk does definitely help lessen the CPU load. I also realised during my play here just how rusty I am. I haven't played Tekken seriously since like Tekken Tag, and I did dabble a little bit in Tekken 5, so let's just say it was a very long time ago, and my ability to do electrics as well on Xbox pads absolutely sucks. Hellblade 2 is another game which uses the Unreal 5 engine, and it is a technical powerhouse really showcasing the Xbox hardware as well as the PC. You can imagine my surprise then when the game actually did load and the in-engine sequence started to play out with just a single P core available to it. Well, that was just too good to be true. The moment you take control of Senua, Hellblade 2 crashes. I decided to try for a second time just to ensure that I hadn't had any bad luck, and there was no joy to be found. No joy to be found? Pretty much the same experience as actually playing the game then, really, I guess. I then went through more crashes by throwing additional E cores at the problem and then an additional P core, so that's 3 threads total and 4 threads total respectively, and still the same thing. I realised at this stage that I hadn't actually tested the game with all of the cores enabled, so I figured it's probably best to turn on all of the cores, do a check of the actual installation of the game just to make sure that there isn't a problem with the installation, and no, the game did load and I got past the intro for the first time. I decided to reboot again, 2 P cores, and the logic is that I had made it past the intro at this point, so maybe things would be different. No, they weren't. Oh, and just as a bonus, had I mentioned that each time this happened I had to rewatch the intro, which is very lengthy by the way, from the beginning, and you can't skip it. Fortunately, I'm professional and I wasn't getting mad or frustrated, I promise. I eventually got the game working with 3 P cores and 6 threads available, and at this point, it was very playable of course. The moral of the story, if there is one to any of this video, that Unreal 5's most demanding games just heavily push your system and will probably continue to get worse going forward. So what about Dead Space Remake? Well, the minimum configuration I could get this game to load for me with is 2 performance cores with 4 threads. As I showed earlier on the video, some games just would not load with a single performance core with SMT, and this of course is one of those titles. I also tried enabling a single E core and the game would still just conk on startup. With 4 threads though, the game was very playable indeed. Depending on the area of the game, we would go from high 60s to close to perhaps 100, but obviously different areas would stress the CPU in different ways. Perhaps you would get some loading in the background, or lots of monsters would be spawning in, what have you, and therefore inconsistent frame times were, well, not irregular, and that's putting it very nicely. Curiously though, if we peek at the minimum specifications of the game on the Steam page, it recommends an i5-8600 from Intel or a Ryzen 2600 from AMD. So that's a minimum of 6 cores with 12 threads in the case of the Zen Plus based CPU. Really, when you think about it, the engine is doing a pretty good job here, trying to squeeze everything it can out of just those 4 threads. Another game which is absolutely gorgeous to look at is Alan Wake 2, and I want to finish my coverage using it. It's powered by the Northlight engine, and in short, the game runs pretty flawlessly with only a single performance core and a single E core, so that's 3 threads total. A single P core would not let me boot into the game, but Again, with those 2 cores enabled, we're running with all of the settings maxed, no DLSS frame generation, and with DLAA enabled too. Frame rates hover between mid-30s to 40s, but of course the 4090 is being hideously underused. So there you have it guys, it's been a bit of a fun video to make. I have to confess, I was genuinely surprised that certain games did run with so few threads available, and I think titles like Alan Wake 2 perhaps surprised me the most. Obviously games like Cyberpunk technically did work, but they're not exactly in what I would consider an enjoyable state with only a single processor core. But it is still very impressive, the fact that the engine did manage to schedule work and just didn't outright crash. There will be a lot more fun videos like this on the channel over the next several months. There's going to be a number of projects that I'm working on actually. So do, of course, subscribe to the channel if you want just more silly projects and a lot more serious ones. With that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.